it's interesting that I find it interesting that the early church, when it began, really didn't have much of an understanding. First, didn't really understand who Jesus was. It certainly didn't understanding of the Trinity and Jesus as fully divine and fully human that we pick up later in the church. But were prepared to follow him and die because of him. So the most important thing about the cross is God is revealed, Jesus is God in some way, and God does something amazing on the cross. And that immediately opens up for people who are following Jesus. The church then starts to ask questions about, why did Jesus die? What happened on the cross? So in theology, we use this word atonement, and that's the word to say, well, actually, why was Christ's death necessary? Now, the cross is much bigger than just Jesus' death itself, but if we take that one issue, atonement, and the church has had lots of different understandings of atonement in history. Some churches prefer ones to others. My particular view, and that of the Vineyard, would be that all these different understandings of atonement, there's ransom and a moral example and Christus Victor and penal substitution, some of these things people will have heard, they all go together to give us a picture of what we can't fully describe. But for me, I think the cross is important and central because God enters into our world and Christ enters into fully everything we experience. He lives, he suffers, he dies, and takes upon himself the consequences of everything that every human being has in their broken relationship. And that's why, alongside atonement, the doctrine of the fall. So, and again, I'll quote Augustine. Augustine reminds us and says that it's not that we've fallen from God. We can't fall from God, or we would all die automatically. The problem is, Augustine says, we've fallen into ourselves. We've become lost to ourselves and to one another. And what Christ does, Christ comes into the world and enables us to find ourselves and find our way back to God. But ultimately, the only way for him to do that is to go to the cross and deal with a whole host of things. Our fallenness, our brokenness, the suffering that we cause, the demonic powers in the world, everything that the enemy is doing. I mean, the cross is all those things and more. The last thing on this that I found helpful is communion. Paul tells us in communion that we are to take communion and we are remembered to Christ, which is interesting in a consumer context because it means actually when we receive communion, Christ consumes us. And the word remember is the opposite of being dismembered. Remember is a pretty weak word, and you think it's recalling, but to be remembered is to actually, when you've been dismembered, to be joined. So the idea of the cross and communion is that when Paul warns us, he says it's why people fall asleep and die and drink judgment on themselves. Paul's saying essentially when you take communion, what you're saying is, Jesus, would you rip me, tear me away from everything I have joined myself to that is not of you and that will suffer death for eternity, and join me to you. And for me at the minute, that's one of the ways I'm really understanding the power of the cross to rip us away from our fears, our anxieties, the power that work has over us, ill health, our concerns for the future, and ultimately we are joined to Christ into eternity. That's a little bit maybe of what the cross is about.